3 weeks after I gave birth to twin boys, I woke up and found my husband gone. His clothes were gone, his truck was gone, and even his wedding ring was sitting on the kitchen counter. At first I thought he had simply panicked. Becoming a father to twins was overwhelming, and I convinced myself he just needed time. Then the bills started arriving. Credit cards I had never seen before, personal loans I had never agreed to, business debts I had never heard of. Within days, debt collectors were calling my phone nonstop. That's when I learned the truth. My husband hadn't just abandoned me and our newborn sons. He had left me with nearly $480,000 in debt. I was 29 years old, recovering from childbirth, barely sleeping, barely eating, and desperately trying to keep a roof over my babies' heads. Every day felt like a battle I was losing. I honestly believed my life couldn't get any worse. Then 6 months later, while feeding my sons in a tiny apartment, I turned on the television and nearly dropped the bottle from my hand. There he was, my husband, smiling for the cameras, holding a giant lottery check worth $28 million, standing beside a younger woman with his arm around her waist as if we had never existed. In that moment, I felt something inside me break. But what I didn't know then was that winning that lottery would become to the worst thing that had ever happened to him. Looking back now, I realized there were warning signs long before everything fell apart. But at the time, I was too happy to see them. My name is Sarah, and 6 years ago, I married the man I believed I would grow old with. Jason wasn't rich, and neither was I. We built our life the way most ordinary couples do. One paycheck at a time, one sacrifice at a time, and one dream at a time. We bought a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, spent weekends fixing things ourselves to save money, and talked endlessly about the family we hoped to have one day. When I found out I was pregnant with twins, it felt like every struggle had finally been worth it. Jason seemed excited too. He attended doctor's appointments, helped assemble the nursery furniture, and spent hours debating baby names with me. Everyone around us thought we were the perfect couple. Our families admired us. Our friends envied us. Even I believed we had survived the hardest years and were about to enter the happiest chapter of our lives. But during the final months of my pregnancy, something began to change. Jason started coming home later than usual. He became distracted, constantly checking his phone and stepping outside to take calls. Whenever I asked what was wrong, he blamed stress from work. I wanted to believe him. After all, we were preparing for 2 babies instead of 1, and the financial pressure was real. So I ignored the uneasy feeling growing in the back of my mind. As my due date approached, I focused entirely on our sons. I spent my days washing tiny clothes, organizing diapers, and imagining what our life would look like once they arrived. I truly believed that despite the challenges ahead, we would face them together as a family. I had no idea that while I was preparing to become a mother, my husband was already preparing to disappear from our lives forever. The twins arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning after nearly 14 hours of labor. I was exhausted, terrified, and happier than I had ever been in my life. When the nurses placed my sons in my arms for the first time, nothing else mattered. Not the hospital bills, not the sleepless nights waiting ahead, not the stress that had been hanging over our family for months. Jason stood beside my bed, holding one of the boys, smiling for photos and telling everyone how lucky he felt. Looking back, that was one of the last times I ever saw him act like a father. The first couple of weeks after we came home were a blur of diapers, feedings, crying, and exhaustion. I barely slept more than a few hours each night. Jason claimed he was working longer hours to help cover expenses, so I didn't question it when he left early and came home late. I was too busy trying to keep 2 newborns alive. Then one morning, exactly 3 weeks after the twins were born, I woke up and noticed Jason wasn't in bed. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he had gone to work early. Maybe he had gone out for coffee. But as the hours passed, a strange feeling settled in my stomach. His phone went straight to voicemail. His text messages remained unanswered. By noon, I checked our closet and felt my heart drop. Half his clothes were gone. His suitcase was gone. His laptop was gone. When I walked into the kitchen, I found his wedding ring sitting on the counter beside a short handwritten note. It contained only 6 words. "I'm sorry. I can't do this." That was it. No explanation, no address, no promise to come back. Nothing. I called his parents. They hadn't heard from him. I called his friends. None of them knew where he was. By the end of the day, panic had completely taken over. The next morning, I contacted his employer, hoping they might know something. Instead, I learned something that made my blood run cold. Jason hadn't been working overtime. In fact, he had quit his job nearly 2 months before the twins were born. Constantly every late night, every secret phone call, and every strange excuse started making sense. My husband hadn't panicked and run away overnight. He had been planning his escape for months while I was carrying our children. For the first few days after Jason disappeared, I kept telling myself there had to be some explanation. Maybe he was having a breakdown. Maybe he had gotten involved in some kind of trouble and was too ashamed to tell me. Maybe he would eventually come back and explain everything. Then the mail started arriving. At first, it was just a few envelopes marked urgent. I tossed them onto the kitchen counter, assuming they were ordinary bills. But one afternoon, while the twins were finally asleep, I opened the first envelope and felt my stomach tighten. It was a notice from a credit card company demanding immediate payment on an account with a balance of nearly $38,000. I didn't recognize the account number. I didn't even know the card existed. Then I opened the second envelope. Another credit card. Another large balance. Then a third, and a fourth. By the end of that evening, my entire dining table was covered with overdue notices. The next morning, the phone calls began. Collection agencies, banks, lenders. Every conversation made the situation worse. Over the next 2 weeks, I uncovered loan after loan that Jason had taken out without ever telling me. Personal loans, business loans, lines of credit. Some were in his name alone, but many had been opened using joint financial information connected to our marriage. I spent hours speaking with bank representatives while holding one crying baby in each arm. Every new document felt like another punch to the chest. The final number was almost impossible to believe. Nearly $480,000. $480,000. I remember staring at the figure on a legal pad in complete silence. We weren't wealthy people. We had never owned expensive cars. We had never taken luxury vacations. We lived in an ordinary house in an ordinary neighborhood. Where had all that money gone? The more I investigated, the stranger everything became. Large withdrawals had been made months before the twins were born. Accounts had been emptied. Savings I thought we still had were gone. It was as if my husband had been quietly dismantling our entire financial life, while I was busy preparing for motherhood. Then came the worst discovery of all. The mortgage was behind on payments. Not by 1 month, not by 2 months, by almost 6 months. Jason had stopped paying long before he disappeared. That was the moment reality finally hit me. My husband hadn't abandoned us in a moment of panic. He hadn't made a terrible mistake. He had carefully planned every step. He had drained our finances, buried me under a mountain of debt, and walked away, knowing I would be left alone with 2 newborn babies and a future that suddenly looked impossible. The months that followed were the hardest of my life. There was no dramatic rescue, no mysterious inheritance, and no family member stepping in to save me. Every morning I woke up to the same reality. 2 newborn babies depending on me and a financial disaster. I had no idea how to escape. The foreclosure notices kept coming. The collection agencies kept calling. Some days I felt like I spent more time talking to creditors than to other adults. Eventually, I had no choice but to sell almost everything I owned. The first thing to go was my car, then some of my jewelry, then furniture. I even sold my wedding ring, the same ring Jason had placed on my finger 6 years earlier, while promising he would always protect our family. The amount I received for it was far less than what it had cost. But by then, sentiment meant nothing. Formula, diapers, and rent were all that mattered. Losing the house was even worse. I fought to keep it for as long as I could, but the numbers simply didn't work. One rainy afternoon, I carried my sons out of the home where I had imagined raising them and moved into a tiny 2-bedroom apartment on the other side of town. I cried that night after putting the twins to sleep. Not because the apartment was small, but because it felt like the final proof that everything I had built had been taken away. To survive, I accepted every job I could find. During the day, I worked remotely answering customer service calls while caring for the babies. At night, after a neighbor agreed to watch them for a few hours, I cleaned office buildings. I often returned home after midnight, exhausted beyond words, only to wake up again a few hours later when one of the boys started crying. Then one night, everything became even worse. One of the twins developed a high fever. At first, I hoped it was something minor, but as the hours passed, his temperature kept rising. By midnight, I was sitting in the emergency room holding my baby against my chest while doctors rushed him through examinations. I remember looking around that hospital room feeling completely alone. No husband, no family nearby, no one to help, just me and my 2 children. When the doctor finally assured me that my son would recover, I felt relief for the first time all night. Then the billing paperwork arrived. I stared at the estimated costs and felt my stomach drop. I honestly didn't know how I was going to pay it. I checked my bank account from my phone while sitting beside my son's hospital bed. After rent, utilities, groceries, and diapers, there was barely anything left. I remember lowering my head and crying as quietly as I could so the boys wouldn't hear me. That was the lowest moment of my life. Not when Jason left, not when I lost the house, not when I discovered the debt. It was sitting in that hospital room, realizing that despite working every hour I possibly could, I still wasn't sure I could afford to keep my children safe. Yet somehow, the twins kept me moving forward. Every smile, every laugh, every tiny milestone reminded me why I couldn't give up. I stopped waiting for Jason to come back. I stopped hoping for an explanation. As far as I was concerned, he was gone forever. What I didn't know was that while I was sitting in hospital waiting rooms wondering how to pay medical bills, Jason was already living a completely different life, and very soon, I was about to discover just how cruel his betrayal really was. 6 months passed before I saw Jason again. By then, I had stopped searching for him. The police couldn't help, because he hadn't committed a crime by simply leaving. His family claimed they had no idea where he was. His friends either genuinely knew nothing, or refused to tell me. Eventually, I accepted that he had vanished, and focused all my energy on surviving. Then one ordinary evening changed everything. The twins were finally asleep after a difficult day, and I was sitting in our tiny apartment eating a microwave dinner while watching the local news. I wasn't really paying attention until I heard the anchor announce that a record-breaking lottery jackpot had been claimed by a resident from our state. A smiling man appeared on the screen, holding one of those oversized checks worth millions of dollars. At first, I barely looked up. Then my fork slipped from my hand and hit the floor. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I couldn't even process what I was seeing. The man standing in front of the cameras was Jason, husband, the father of my children. The same man who had disappeared and left us drowning in debt. The same man who had abandoned 2 newborn babies without a second thought. He stood there grinning as photographers snapped pictures around him. The amount displayed on the check was $28 million. $28 million. I replayed the segment 3 times because part of me refused to believe it was real. But every time, there he was, looking healthier than ever, wearing an expensive suit, smiling as if he didn't have a family somewhere struggling to survive. Then the camera shifted slightly, and I felt a fresh wave of anger rush through me. Standing beside him was a young blonde woman with her arm wrapped around his waist. She wasn't a reporter, she wasn't a friend. She was clearly his girlfriend. The way they looked at each other made that obvious. While I had spent months wondering how to buy enough formula for the twins, Jason had apparently built an entirely new life. I sat in silence, long after the news segment ended. The betrayal hurt more than I can describe. Not because he had become rich, not because he had found another woman, but because he had looked completely happy. There was no guilt in his eyes, no regret, no sign that he missed his sons. It was as if we had never existed. The next morning, every local news website carried the same story. Jason was being called the state's newest millionaire. Interviews began appearing online. Reporters described him as an ordinary man whose life had changed overnight. But as I read article after article, something didn't feel right. The timeline didn't make sense. The more I looked into it, the more questions I had. And for the first time since he disappeared, I stopped thinking about survival and started thinking about answers. Over the next several weeks, it became impossible to escape Jason's new life. His lottery win was everywhere. Local newspapers ran feature stories about him. Television stations interviewed him. Social media accounts reposted photos of him standing beside luxury cars, expensive restaurants, and tropical beaches. Every time I opened my phone, there seemed to be another reminder of the life he was living, while his children grew up without him. What made it even worse was the way people talked about him. Reporters described him as hardworking, humble, and deserving of his good fortune. Friends left comments congratulating him on his success. Strangers called him inspirational. Nobody knew that the man they were celebrating had abandoned his wife and newborn sons just weeks after they were born. Nobody knew that while he was buying champagne and designer clothes, collection agencies were still calling me about debts he had left behind. One afternoon, I watched an interview that nearly made me turn off the television forever. The reporter asked Jason what he planned to do with his winnings. He laughed and said he wanted to enjoy life, travel the world, and focus on the future. The future. I remember staring at the screen wondering how he could say those words so casually. His future was sitting in a cramped apartment learning how to crawl. His future had his eyes, his smile, and his last name. Yet he spoke as though his children didn't exist. The most painful moment came a few weeks later. One of my coworkers sent me a link to an article without realizing who Jason was. The headline described him as a lucky bachelor, starting a new chapter of life with his girlfriend. Bachelor. The word hit me like a punch to the stomach. In public, he wasn't pretending to be separated. He wasn't pretending to be divorced. He was pretending I had never existed at all. That night, after putting the twins to bed, I sat alone in the dark and looked through the photos on my phone. Pictures from our wedding. Pictures from family holidays. Pictures from the hospital on the day our sons were born. In every image, Jason looked like a loving husband and father. Yet somehow that man no longer existed. The more I thought about everything that had happened, the angrier I became. Not just because he had abandoned us. Not just because he had hidden money and buried me in debt. But because he was being rewarded for it. He had destroyed our lives and somehow walked away richer, happier, and more admired than ever. For months, I had focused on surviving. I had accepted every hardship because I believed I had no choice. But sitting there in the darkness, watching another interviews, celebrating the man who had ruined my life, something changed inside me. For the first time, I stopped asking why this had happened. Instead, I started asking a different question. What if Jason hadn't been nearly as smart as he thought he was? The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. For months, I had focused on surviving. But after seeing Jason on television, smiling beside a $28 million lottery check, I wanted answers. The story simply didn't make sense. Jason hadn't disappeared overnight. He had quit his job before the twins were born, emptied our savings, accumulated enormous debt, and then vanished just weeks before winning millions of dollars. The more I reviewed our financial records, the more suspicious everything became. I discovered a secret bank account he had never told me about, and several large withdrawals made before he disappeared. But the biggest shock came when a private investigator uncovered evidence that Jason's relationship with the blonde woman on television had started long before he left. They had been seeing each other while I was pregnant, while I was preparing our nursery, while he was pretending to be a devoted husband. Suddenly, every late night at work and every secret phone call finally made sense. Jason hadn't panicked when life became difficult. He had been planning an entirely different future for months. For the first time, I began to suspect that abandoning his family wasn't a mistake. It was part of a plan. The breakthrough came from the last persons I ever expected to help me. Jason's girlfriend. One evening, she contacted my attorney and asked to meet privately. Her name was Vanessa, and the confident woman I had seen standing beside Jason on television looked completely different in person. She was exhausted, anxious, and clearly unhappy. During our meeting, she revealed that Jason had lied to her from the very beginning. He told her our marriage was already over. He claimed we were separated long before he left. But after the lottery money arrived, she began discovering things he had hidden from both of us. Financial records, family photographs, documents connected to our children. The more she learned, the more she realized Jason had been deceiving everyone around him. Then she shared something that changed the entire case. For months, she had secretly recorded arguments between them. In those recordings, Jason openly discussed hiding money, abandoning his family, and protecting his future wealth. The most damaging recording contained a sentence none of us would ever forget. "Those babies ruined everything. Leaving was the best decision I ever made." When the recording ended, the room fell silent. For the first time since Jason disappeared, we finally had something more powerful than suspicion. We had proof. The person who ultimately changed everything wasn't a lawyer, a private investigator, or a financial expert. It was Jason's girlfriend, the woman I had spent months hating, the woman I blamed for helping destroy my family. Her name was Vanessa, and one evening she contacted my attorney's office asking if she could speak with us privately. At first, I thought it was some kind of trick. Why would she suddenly want to help me? But when we finally met, the woman sitting across from me looked nothing like the confident person I had seen fuse in magazine photos and television interviews. She looked exhausted, nervous, frightened. For almost 10 minutes she barely spoke. Then she told us the truth. Jason had lied to her too. According to Vanessa, he had claimed that our marriage was already over long before he left. He told her we were living separate lives. He told her I was planning to file for divorce. He even claimed I had no interest in having a relationship with him anymore. At first, Vanessa believed everything he said. Then, after the lottery money arrived, his behavior began to change. He became controlling, secretive, paranoid about money. He constantly moved funds between accounts and refused to explain where large amounts of cash were going. Whenever she asked questions, he became angry. The turning point came when she accidentally discovered documents hidden inside a locked desk drawer. Those documents included old photographs of our family, records related to the twins, and copies of financial statements showing debts he had concealed from both of us. That was when she realized Jason had never been honest with anyone. He hadn't just betrayed his wife. He had manipulated everyone around him. Then Vanessa revealed something even more important. For months, she had been quietly recording arguments between them because she feared his increasingly unpredictable behavior. At first, my attorney and I exchanged cautious glances. Recordings could be useful, but they often contained nothing significant. Then Vanessa played one of them. The room went silent. Jason's voice filled the office. He wasn't angry in the recording. He wasn't shouting. In some ways, that made it even worse. He sounded calm, casual, almost proud. During the conversation, he openly discussed leaving me before the twins were born. He laughed about hiding money. He mocked the financial problems I was facing. Then came the sentence that none of us would ever forget. "Those babies ruined everything. Leaving was the best decision I ever made." For a moment, nobody spoke. I felt physically sick hearing it. My attorney immediately asked Vanessa if she had additional recordings. She nodded. There were several. Some discussed hidden assets. Others discussed his plans before disappearing. Piece by piece, they revealed a man who had knowingly abandoned his family while protecting his own financial future. When the meeting finally ended, my attorney looked at me and said something I had been waiting years to hear. "This changes everything." For the first time since Jason walked away, we weren't chasing suspicions anymore. We had evidence, real evidence, and very soon, Jason was going to learn that all the money in the world couldn't protect him from the truth. Once the recordings were authenticated, everything moved much faster than Jason expected. My attorney filed a series of motions that forced him to respond under oath. For the first time since disappearing, he could no longer hide behind television interviews, carefully crafted public statements, or social media posts. Now he had to answer questions in a legal setting where lies carried consequences. At first, Jason acted exactly as we predicted. He denied everything. He claimed he had never intentionally abandoned his family. He argued that the debts were the result of failed investments and financial mistakes. He insisted the timing of his departure and the lottery win was merely an incredible coincidence. To anyone who didn't know the facts, parts of his story almost sounded believable, but every explanation he offered created new contradictions. Every document we produced made his position weaker. Every recording Vanessa provided made it harder for him to deny what he had done. During one deposition, he claimed he had always and was intended to support his children. My attorney immediately presented months of bank records, showing virtually no financial support after he disappeared. On another occasion, he claimed he had never hidden assets. Minutes later, evidence surfaced showing properties and vehicles connected to companies that existed largely on paper. Slowly, the confident public image he had built began to crack. The turning point came during a pretrial hearing attended by attorneys, court staff, and several observers from local media outlets. My attorney requested permission to introduce portions of the recordings into evidence. Jason's legal team fought aggressively to keep them out, which only increased everyone's curiosity. After lengthy arguments, the judge allowed key portions to be reviewed. When Jason's own voice filled the courtroom, the atmosphere changed instantly. There was no misunderstanding what he meant. There was no innocent explanation. The recordings revealed a man discussing hidden money, mocking the struggles of his wife, and speaking about his first children as though they were obstacles rather than human beings. Then the most damaging recording was played. The one Vanessa had first shared with us months earlier. The room became completely silent as Jason casually said, "Those babies ruined everything. Leaving was the best decision I ever made." I looked across the room and saw something I had never seen before. Fear. For the first time since this nightmare began, Jason looked genuinely afraid. Not because he was losing money. Not because he was facing legal consequences, but because he realized everyone was finally seeing who he really was. The devoted husband, the lucky lottery winner, the inspirational success story. All of it was collapsing. The judge's expression hardened. Reporters in the gallery began taking notes. Even some members of Jason's own legal team appeared uncomfortable. By the time the hearing ended, the story was no longer about a man who had won $28 million. It was about a father who had abandoned his newborn children, hidden assets, manipulated multiple women, and built his fortune on a foundation of deception. As we walked out of the courthouse that day, my attorney quietly smiled and said, "He's not fighting to win anymore. He's fighting to survive." And for the first time in years, I believed he was right. The final court proceedings took place nearly 3 years after Jason had walked out of our lives. By then, the twins were old enough to run through the apartment laughing and asking questions about everything around them. They knew their father existed, but they had no real memories of him. To them, he was little more than a name. In many ways, that reality hurt Jason far more than any legal argument ever could. By the time the case reached its final stage, the evidence against him had become overwhelming. The recordings, the hidden accounts, the concealed assets, the misleading financial disclosures. The pattern was impossible to ignore. What had started as a family dispute had evolved into a detailed examination of years of deception. During the proceedings, Jason attempted one final strategy. He portrayed himself as a man who had made mistakes but wanted to repair the damage. He spoke about second chances. He spoke about personal growth. He spoke about rebuilding relationships. But every time he tried to present himself as a changed man, another piece of evidence reminded everyone who he had been when it mattered most. My attorney presented timelines showing exactly when Jason began moving money. Records showed when he quit his job. Documents showed when he stopped making mortgage payments. The dates lined up almost perfectly with my pregnancy and the months leading up to the twins' birth. It became increasingly difficult for anyone to believe that these were random decisions. The judge spent hours reviewing financial records and testimony. When the final ruling was delivered, the courtroom became so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat. The judge found that Jason had deliberately concealed assets, failed to meet financial responsibilities related to his family, and engaged in a pattern of conduct designed to shield wealth while leaving others to carry the consequences. Several financial protections Jason believed would shield his fortune were dismantled. Assets connected to various entities were subjected to review. Significant financial obligations were imposed. Long overdue child support calculations were ordered. Additional monetary judgments followed. I wasn't suddenly handed millions of dollars. This wasn't one of those unrealistic stories where everything changes overnight. But something far more important happened. The truth became official. Jason could no longer hide behind the image he had created. The court record told a very different story than the one he had sold to the public. As we exited the courthouse, Reporters crowded around him rather than me. A few years earlier, they had wanted photographs of the smiling lottery winner. Now they wanted answers about hidden assets, abandoned children, and deceptive financial conduct. Jason lowered his head and pushed through the crowd without speaking. It was the first time I had ever seen him look small. For years, he had controlled the narrative. He had controlled the money. He had controlled the lies. But standing there outside the courthouse, surrounded by cameras, he could no longer charm. It was obvious that the life he had spent so much effort building was finally beginning to collapse. The collapse didn't happen overnight. In many ways, that made it even more satisfying. For years, Jason had believed money could solve every problem he created. When he abandoned his family, money gave him freedom. When questions started his door, money bought lawyers. When his public image began to crack, money paid for public relations experts and carefully crafted statements. But after the court ruling, money stopped working the way it used to. One by one, the foundations of his new life began to disappear. The first thing to go was his reputation. News outlets that had once celebrated his lottery win now focused on the court findings and financial misconduct. Online comments turned hostile. Former supporters distanced themselves. Business opportunities vanished. Then came the financial consequences. Legal obligations, settlements, support payments, and ongoing litigation costs started consuming enormous amounts of money. Properties that once symbolized success became liabilities. Expensive vehicles were sold. Luxury memberships disappeared. Staff members were let go. The image of effortless wealth slowly unraveled. Around the same time, Vanessa left him for good. According to mutual acquaintances, she realized that every major relationship in Jason's life followed the same pattern: charm, manipulation, lies, and eventually betrayal. The man who once seemed larger than life was suddenly living alone. No family, no partner, no close friends willing to stand beside him publicly. What surprised me most was how little satisfaction I felt from watching his financial downfall. Years earlier, I thought that was what I wanted. I imagined that seeing him lose money somehow erased the pain he had caused. It didn't. The real victory came from something else. My life was no longer controlled by his choices. The twins were thriving. I had rebuilt my finances slowly and honestly. I had started a small business that was finally growing. For the first time in years, our future felt stable. Meanwhile, Jason spent his days fighting problems he had created himself. Every lie had eventually demanded a price. Every shortcut had eventually led somewhere darker. One afternoon, nearly 4 years after he abandoned us, I received a phone call from an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end belonged to Jason. It was the first time I had heard him speak directly to me in years. He sounded older, tired, defeated. After a few awkward moments, he asked if we could talk, really talk. He said he had made mistakes. He said he regretted what happened. He said he wanted a chance to explain everything. As I listened, I realized something important. For the first time since he disappeared, Jason wasn't calling because he felt powerful. He was calling because he had run out of places to hide. And although he didn't know it yet, the hardest part of his punishment was still waiting for him. A few months after that phone call, Jason began trying to reconnect with the twins. At first, it started with small things. Birthday cards arrived in the mail. Then came expensive gifts: remote control cars, gaming consoles, bicycles that cost more than anything I would have ever purchased for children their age. I understood what he was trying to do. For most of his life, money had solved his problems. Money had helped him impress people, avoid consequences, and create the image he wanted others to see. But children don't measure love the same way adults do. The twins politely thanked him for the gifts, but they showed no excitement about the person sending them. To them, the presents came from a stranger. Eventually, Jason requested supervised visits. After discussing it carefully with counselors and legal professionals, I agreed. I never wanted my sons to grow up believing I had kept their father away from them. If a relationship was possible, it had to succeed or fail based on Jason's own actions. The first meeting was one of the saddest experiences of my life. Jason arrived early, dressed neatly and carrying gifts. He looked nervous. For years he had imagined this moment, the chance to finally see his sons, the chance to fix everything. But reality didn't unfold the way he expected. When the boys entered the room, they didn't run toward him. They didn't smile. They didn't even seem particularly curious. They stayed close to me and quietly asked who he was. That question hit Jason harder than any court ruling ever could. Who is he? Not dad, not father, just he. During the visit, Jason tried his best. He asked about school. He asked about their hobbies. He asked about their favorite sports and television shows. The boys answered politely, but there was no connection, no shared memories, no natural bond. Every story they told involved me. Every achievement they mentioned involved me. Every childhood memory they laughed about involved moments Jason had never been there to witness. As the visits continued over the following months, a painful pattern emerged. The twins weren't angry with Jason. Anger would have at least meant he occupied an important place in their lives. Instead, they felt almost nothing. To them, he was simply a man who appeared years after everyone else who mattered had already been there. One evening, after another supervised visit, one of the boys asked me a question while we were driving home. "Mom, why does he keep trying so hard now?" I sat silently for a moment, unsure how to answer. Before I could say anything, his brother spoke from the back seat. Maybe because he missed everything. The words were simple, childlike even, but they captured the truth perfectly. Jason had missed first steps, first words, first birthdays, first days of school, countless ordinary moments that eventually become a childhood. And no amount of money, regret, or apologies could bring any of them back. For years, Jason believed losing his fortune would be the worst thing that could happen to him. He was wrong. The worst punishment was sitting across from two boys who carried his last name, shared his eyes, and looked at him with the same polite distance they would show any stranger. The moment that finally brought this chapter of our lives to an end happened almost 8 years after Jason walked away. By then, the twins were thriving. They were doing well in school, playing sports, making friends, and growing into kind, young boys. Our life wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful. We had built something real together, something that survived every hardship thrown at us. One spring afternoon, their elementary school hosted an awards ceremony, recognizing students for academic achievement and community involvement. It wasn't a huge event, just a school auditorium filled with parents, teachers, and excited children. I arrived early and took my seat near the front. As I looked around the room, I noticed a familiar figure standing quietly near the back wall. It was Jason. He hadn't told me he was coming. He simply stood there alone with his hands in his pockets, us watching from a distance. For a brief moment, I felt the old anger trying to return, but it disappeared almost immediately. Too much time had passed. The anger no longer had a place in my life. The ceremony began, and one by one students were called onto the stage. Eventually, both of my sons heard their names announced. They walked across the stage to receive awards for academic excellence and leadership. I felt tears forming in my eyes as the audience applauded. Not because of the awards themselves, but because I remembered everything it had taken to reach that moment. The sleepless nights, the unpaid bills, the fear, the loneliness, every sacrifice suddenly felt worth it. After the ceremony ended, families gathered throughout the auditorium taking photographs and congratulating their children. The twins immediately spotted me and ran across the room. They wrapped their arms around me so tightly that I could barely move. One of them held up his award and said, "Mom, look, we did it." Then his brother smiled and added something I will never forget. "We couldn't have done any of this without you." I laughed through my tears and hugged them both. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the debt, not the court battles, not the years of struggle, just the three of us standing together. Then I happened to glance toward the back of the auditorium. Jason was still there, watching, alone. He had heard every word. For a few seconds, our eyes met across the room. There was no anger in his expression anymore. No arrogance, no excuses. Only regret. The kind of regret that arrives years too late. He took a small step forward, as if considering whether to approach. But before he could move any closer, the boys turned back toward me, excitedly talking about school, friends, and plans for the weekend. They never even noticed him standing there. Eventually, Jason stopped walking. He looked at the boys one last time, lowered his head, and quietly made his way toward the exit. No one stopped him. No one called his name. No dramatic confrontation took place. The auditorium doors closed behind him, and life continued exactly as it had before. As I watched my sons laughing together, I finally understood something. For years, I believed the story was about the money he won and later lost. But it wasn't. The real story was about choices. Jason chose money over family. He chose selfishness over responsibility. He chose to walk away when his children needed him most. And in the end, those choices cost him the only things he could never get back. Meanwhile, the two little boys he abandoned grew up surrounded by love, stability, and people who never left. Looking back now, I don't think I won because Jason lost. I think I won because when everything fell apart, I stayed. And sometimes, staying is the most powerful thing a person can do. A few weeks after the awards ceremony, I received a call from the boys' school counselor. At first, I thought something was wrong. Instead, she told me about a class assignment the students had recently completed. Each child had been asked to write a short essay about the person they admired most.
That's
The counselor explained that both of my sons had written about the same person and thought I might want to read what they had written. Later that evening, after the boys were asleep, I opened the envelopes she had sent home. I expected simple answers about a parent or a teacher. What I found instead left me in tears. My first son wrote that the person he admired most was his mother because she never quit, even when things were hard. He wrote about late nights when I helped him with homework after working all day. He wrote about soccer games, school projects, scraped knees, birthday parties, and all the little moments I barely remembered. Then I opened the second essay. My other son had written something similar. Near the end, one sentence caught my attention. He wrote, "Some kids have superheroes in movies. My hero lives in my house." I sat there holding those papers long after I finished reading them. A few days later, during one of Jason's scheduled visits, the boys casually mentioned the assignment. Curious, Jason asked who they had chosen. Neither boy hesitated. "Mom," they answered immediately. Jason smiled and nodded, but I saw something change in his face. Then he asked a question he probably should never have asked. "What about your dad?" The room fell silent for a moment. Finally, one of the twins looked at him and shrugged. "You weren't really there. The words weren't angry. They weren't meant to hurt. That was what made them so devastating. They were simply true." Jason lowered his eyes and didn't speak for several seconds. In that moment, I think he finally understood something. No court ruling, no financial loss, and no public humiliation had been able to teach him. Children don't remember who had the most money. They don't remember who drove the nicest car. They remember who showed up, who stayed, who was there when they were scared, sick, excited, proud, or heartbroken. Jason had spent years chasing millions of dollars. He got the money. Then he lost most of it. But the thing he never realized was that the most important investment of his life had been waiting for him in a nursery with 2 newborn boys, and he walked away from it. As we left that visit, the twins ran ahead of me toward the parking lot, laughing about something that had happened at school. I watched them for a moment before following behind. When I glanced back one last time, Jason was still standing alone near the building entrance, watching them disappear into the distance. That was the last time I ever saw him. And as I drove home with my sons, I realized that karma hadn't taken his money. Karma had done something far worse. It had allowed him to live long enough to understand exactly what he had thrown away.